General Scaparrotti and General Lyons, do you agree with the intelligence community's assessment of the climate change threat?
I do, and I believe that, as you noted, much of this will be drivers for potential conflict, or at least very difficult situations that nations have to deal with. The second, I would point you to the high north, and that's the increasing opening of the northern sea route, and the challenges that presents from a security perspective.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. General Lyons, do you also agree?
Ma'am, I agree. These are sources of conflict, and we certainly have to be prepared to respond to them.
Good.
Elizabeth Warren there asking a couple of generals if they agree about the threat of climate change to national security. Sounds kind of crazy to me, but I want to bring on a different voice here, one that can speak to this from a number of perspectives that I think you don't usually hear. Dr. Caleb Rossiter is with us now. He is from the CO2 Coalition, and he's going to talk to us about what he thinks is really going on with all this climate change alarmism. Dr. Rossiter, thank you so much.
Buck, it's a treat to be with you today. Thank you for the opportunity to talk a little about climate science, which most people run shrieking from the second they hear the words.
So right now, obviously with the Green New Deal, a lot of people are paying attention to this. Before we get into what your position on this is, what is your background on the issue of climate change, and who are the individuals you work with? Give us kind of a quick overview at the CO2 Coalition, which is obviously, people are going to say, a CO2 coalition? I thought CO2 was the enemy, but go ahead.
The founder of this coalition, you'll hear about in the news right now, Professor Will Happer, a physics professor at Princeton, has left us because he's become President Trump's new national security advisor for emerging technologies. Will Happer is the one who's trying to promote a relook by the White House panel of scientists at these claims that carbon dioxide has created a national security climate catastrophe. So you can see where our group is coming from. We're composed of scientists.
But is he a scientist? I mean, people are going to ask, you know how this always goes. Well, does he have a science background?
Are you kidding? Will Happer is one of America's most distinguished physicists. He ran the science office under President Bush, the first President Bush, in the White House. Our president currently replacing him, Richard Lindzen, is an atmospheric physicist at MIT, has won all the awards for his work on atmospheric dynamics. These people are with us because they used to be with the UN body that makes these wild claims, as AOC said, that we're all going to be dead in 12 years. They left that body in disgust, in horror, at the politicization of science. That's really why they're with us. They want to talk about the science, but the science has been badly, badly perverted.
So tell me then about, and I'm glad, see, this is necessary, though, because as you know, you hear these things like no scientists, people will say, who are in the alarmist camp here, or the catastrophist camp, as I call it. No scientist claims that this isn't really a threat. No real, and then I'll actually name Richard Lindzen, a name that I know from his previous published work on this issue, and they say, well, that doesn't count. I said, oh, an MIT climatologist, that doesn't count. Okay, well, now we're really getting somewhere. But now that we've established that the group that you were with has people with exactly the kind of scientific credentials that should be and must be taken seriously on this issue by the rest of the science and policy community, tell me what the CO2 Coalition is all about.
These are scientists, statisticians like myself, agronomists, physicists, energy economists who want to have a rational public debate about the impact of industrial carbon dioxide over the last 150 years on the planet. And the bait and switch is what I think is confusing your listeners in general, all people in America in general, Buck, because there is a scientific consensus that carbon dioxide is a warming gas. There are physical reasons why it vibrates at the same speed as, heat leaving the earth. But that's it. That's the end of the consensus. How much the warming comes from carbon dioxide being increased by a third over the last 150 years is impossible to assess. We have tried. And let's get to the real topic. What effect does that have on catastrophic variables like floods and droughts and sea level and all that? There's no consensus on that. This is the bait and switch. When Elizabeth Warren is talking to the intelligence community and the military about climate change, you notice they never said the words fossil fuels, CO2, or industrial emissions. Climate changes all the time, and it certainly can be a threat if there's a drought or a lot of storms. But there's no data to indicate that there's been an increase in those climate catastrophe variables, what we call bad weather, since 1900.
Now, is there also an argument to be made that increased CO2 has some good byproducts, some good side effects? I've heard this before, but I want to know if that's a case that you make.
Aha! I'm holding in my hand a brand new white paper that probably America's finest atmospheric agronomist named Craig Idso just put out for us. It wasn't to get plant productivity. It wasn't to get fertilization of crops by industrial carbon dioxide that we entered the fossil fuel era. Obviously, we did it to get cheap, reliable power to, power our health and wealth. But just as people pump CO2 into greenhouses to make their plants grow there, it turns out, this review of all the most relevant new field research, that the 33% increase in CO2 since about 1900 has boosted the productivity of the world's crops by between 15 and 30%. So that has huge implications for places where there's difficulty having their populations get fed. It's like an added bonus we get from the economic growth of fossil fuels is it's plant food. It's been good, and it's going to stay good, and it's going to get better as CO2 levels go up.
So for the non-science science folks in the audience here, including myself, so there's more CO2 in the air, which plants need, and plants then expel, oxygen through photosynthesis, right? And so essentially, this is a good thing for plant life.
It's a fantastic thing for plant life for three quick reasons. I won't bore you with it, but not only do you get 15 to 30% more plant growth so far, and more to come. You need less water because when the plants have higher CO2 levels, they don't perspire, shall we say, so much, and you need less fertilizer. Again, this is why people use greenhouses, and pay for carbon dioxide to be put in their greenhouses. We essentially have created that effect, so it's a nice little bonus. But that doesn't mean that the crucial issue still doesn't remain. If we're going to be using fossil fuels, do they create a climate catastrophe? And the data say so far, and I'm open to the data, I'm a climate statistician, they haven't. And the reports that Ms. Warren would be citing, if you actually read the studies, which is what we do, that the exaggerations come out of, show that there is no statistically significant increase in storms, rate of sea level rise, droughts since 1900. And, it stands to reason. The temperature's only gone up 1 degree worldwide on average since 1900. Maybe half of that has been based on carbon dioxide. The other half, the scientific consensus agrees, was natural because it happened before 1945 when there wasn't much CO2 being pumped. Not necessarily would you get a huge climate result from raising the temperature 1 degree. That's like moving maybe from D.C. Down to Lynchburg,
Yeah, well, see, we're talking to Dr. Caleb Rossiter, everybody. And Dr. Rossiter, I find this really interesting, and all this makes perfect sense to me. In fact, this is what I've been thinking all along, not as a statistician, just as somebody who pays attention and tries to read a lot. But what I want to know is, where is the disconnect then? Because as you no doubt come across this on a regular basis, if you tell people, if you tell a lot of folks, I know there's a political divide here, but if you tell, for example, any of my media colleagues who aren't on the right, if you say that CO2 emissions are not causing catastrophic warming, they launch into just this broadside about how all scientists agree and 99% of scientists and the consensus and all this stuff. What do you say to all that?
The same thing I've been saying since I discovered this as a professor of climate statistics back in 2004. Buck, with my students, because I had to grade their papers, graduate students in statistics, I've read probably every single study of the effects of carbon dioxide on these climate variables to see whether the extreme weather and damaging events, droughts, etc., have increased. And they have not. So what you're actually seeing is a consensus of scientists that CO2 is a warming gas, exaggeration by politicians who say it could cause horrible things in the future. And you know what? It could. We have to wait and see. But so far, they've had 30 years of predictions of disaster in 12 years, and it never happens. I am a Democrat. I will say it. It troubles me that my party has fallen into this camp of saying the science says when that just isn't true. Now the latest one, as you notice, is, and this is good for your background, the intelligence community says, right? Who wouldn't believe the intelligence community? Well, as a Democrat, I can tell you, I would just say weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. We know they can get it wrong sometimes, even though they're trying hard. Why the left just tries to throw out this expertise and say all the scientists, all the intelligence community agrees? No, they don't. Those clips you played at the top of the hour were not about fossil-fueled climate change, because we don't know how much there has been. They were about climate change and extreme weather. One of the good things about CO2 is it's providing more greening in the parts of Africa that do need more food. Perhaps that will help national security.
Is there anyone out there who will debate you and your group in public on this? Because I just think it's so interesting, and for the people listening, it is such a breath of fresh air just to hear someone who's talking about this and say, look, the data doesn't support it. But we're always being bombarded with this message that if we don't, if we don't accept what we're being told, which is that I played clips yesterday, Doc, of people that were saying they don't want to have kids because climate change is so catastrophic. I mean, this has really turned into a mass hysteria.
Topic. You've got people, whether it was population growth or carbon dioxide, you've got people who are always worried about the future. I can't help them when we're living at the highest life expectancy ever in humanity, the best health, the best education. People's lives are the best, in large part because of the miracle of fossil-fueled power that we got in the 20th century. So if they're not having kids now, they certainly should never have had them before. Look, I've been dealing with this for 15 years, and I don't know quite where it came from. This is the one topic that the left refuses to debate. If I show up somewhere, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez sends a letter to the sponsors saying this climate denier should not be allowed to appear, and you should cut off funding for this conference. And so whenever I speak now, I invite her. I sent her office a standing invitation, and I sent a standing invitation to the Union of Concerned Scientists and the Greenpeace and the Environmental Defense Fund. If you're so sure of your case, come and debate it with me. So when I spoke last week at the CPAC conference, I told the story of how when I was an anti-war activist back in the 1960s, we would always put a sign out on the seat, an empty seat on the stage saying, "Reserved for the State Department." So if they wanted to come and argue us at the Vietnam teach-in, we wanted to have the debate because we thought we would win the debate. So mine now says, I put it on the seat every time I speak, is reserved for Rep. Ocasio-Cortez, Greenpeace, and any alarmist in the building.
Well, Doc, I hope that someone takes you up on it, because people need to hear the truth. Because what's being said right now by the entirety of the Democratic Party, the liberal media intelligentsia, even some quarters of the top military brass now, it's just crazy, man. It's just nuts, and people need to get a grip. But that's not my scientific analysis. That's just the way I see things.
Well,
we got Dr. Caleb Rossiter.
They're not going to come. They're not going to.
No, I know. They're going to hide because they're going to get crushed on the facts. Dr. Caleb Rossiter, everybody, the CO2 Coalition. Where can people go to read your research, see more what you're up to?
Well, we have a website, CO2 Coalition, clips of media appearances like this one here. We try to put everything up. But we have 45 members who are far better scientists on this than I am. I'm the climate statistician. We've got people like Dr. Lindzen and Dr. Idso who like to go out and speak and talk about this. They're glad to debate, but since we rarely get to debate, they love to come and speak with people about it. So please check us out and invite us to come talk to someone in your community.
All right. Thank you so much, Doc. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
All right, team. We'll be right back.